Hi, this is JJ at CCBC. In this video we'll look at the Shape tool in Flash. Major topics are the rectangle shape, oval shape, and polystar shape tools, as well as the primitive tools and drawing object mode. The software I'm using for this video is Adobe Flash Creative Suite version 6 on a Mac. So let's take a look at this. Here I have a Flash file already open. What I'm going to do is zoom in to 200% so I have a little more space to work with. And we're going to draw some shapes. So to do that, we're going to use the Shape tool, which is right here. And by default, it's on the Rectangle tool. If I click and hold, you'll notice there's several tools available here. We have a rectangle, an oval, we have a rectangle primitive and an oval primitive tool, as well as a polystar tool. So let's start with the Rectangle tool and work our way through. So with the Rectangle tool, you'll notice I can set a lot of different properties here. There's a set of fill and stroke properties, and there's a set of rectangle specific options down here. I'm going to leave all the defaults. Let's just draw a rectangle, see what it looks like, and then make some changes so you can see how the different properties affect the shape. So here I've made a rectangle. I'm going to select it using my selection tool. I have both the stroke and fill selected. And over here you'll notice I have my position and size, which comes with every object, my fill and stroke properties, which comes with vector shapes, but I don't have those rectangle options here. So it's important to note when you do draw your shapes, some options are only available when you first draw the shape, and then they can't be modified later. So let's look at the ones that can be modified. First we have our stroke color, which is represented by this pencil. We have a fill color represented by this paint bucket, and you just click on the color and choose a new one if you don't like what you have. I kind of like that purple. The stroke thickness, mine is currently a 1. I'm going to set it to 8. So you notice my stroke gets much thicker, and you can see that the corners are a little bit rounded. So let's talk about that. The join property here is your corners. What's it going to look like when one path joins at another path? And for this object is right at the corner here. It's going to round it. Okay, if I change it to bevel, you'll notice I get sort of these flat beveled corners, or joins I should say, and if I change to miter, we get this hard pointy join or corner on our shape. So by default it's round. Another property we can change is the line style. By default it's solid. There's a lot of interesting lines. We could do dots, we could do a stippled line, we could do a ragged line. For this video I'm going to stick with the solid line to show you a few more properties that are easier to see with the solid line than other line types. The cap is the other one I wanted to talk about, but the cap is for when we have the end of a stroke. Now this is a closed pathway, so it's a continuous stroke, there's no end to it. So what I'm going to do is cut this shape in half. Okay, so you can see my stroke comes to an end here, and my stroke comes to an end here, and they're capped. Now by default, let's select my shape, the cap is rounded. If I change to square, you'll notice the cap is now square. Now why is it sticking out like that? Well, let's do the subselection tool for a second. You can see the point here, the cap is actually a square around that point. If we did the rounded, it would be a circle around that point. If we switch to none, you'll notice there's no cap and it's now flush with the fill. Right, so we'll switch back to this tool so you can see a little bit better. So there's no cap on that stroke. So these are all the basic properties of this shape that we can manipulate using the fill and stroke properties. Let's close this shape and make a new one. We're going to make a new rectangle, and we'll change some of the rectangle options. So we know how all of these work. I'm going to leave the defaults. We'll do rounded, normal line. I'm going to leave the stroke thick so it's easy to see. Here in the rectangle options we can set corner radiuses, so we can make some interesting looking rectangles. By default they're all linked, so I'm just going to use this slider to increase to about 20 is good. And if I click and drag, right, you'll notice I have a nice radius of about 20 on each of the corners now. Right? You can also reverse it and do negative amounts. Let's see if we can get negative 21 is close enough. We'll draw the same shape, and you notice the corners are now rounded inwards, which is a pretty interesting effect. I'm going to reset this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to unlink them this time. So notice this locks all the corner radiuses to be equal. If I unlink them, I can change each corner to be a different radius. So I'll do one at 20, the opposite corner at 20, and then I'll leave the other two corners at 0. So if I draw the shape a third time, right, those three shapes are all rectangles. They just have different corner radiuses, creating different visual effects. Now remember, once we've set those corner radiuses, when I select the shape, I can no longer change those corner radiuses. Right? I can't increase or decrease them or edit them in any way. So that's one of the weaknesses of the rectangle tool. Let's see how we might be able to solve that. I'm going to get rid of those shapes, give us some more space to work with, and let's switch to the rectangle primitive tool for a second. I'm just going to draw a rectangle. And you'll notice with the rectangle primitive tool, it leaves a little dot in each of the corners. And if I grab that dot, move it inward, there's that corner radius. So the primitive tool allows me to change the rectangle options on the fly, which is actually pretty cool. All right, so now I can set my radiuses. You'll notice I can't edit the object, so I have to convert it to either a drawing object, which I'll talk about in later in this video, or I can right-click and break it apart, and now I have my vector shape. Right? So now I can play with the fill or the stroke as I see fit. Right? So that's what the primitive tool does. It allows you to manipulate those rectangle options on the fly and still manipulate all these as well. You just have to break out of that primitive editing mode in order to change other things. So let's take a look at the oval tool. Now that we're pretty familiar with the rectangle and rectangle primitive tool, the oval tool does pretty much the same thing. So you notice the fill and stroke properties, these are all the same. None of them have changed. They're exactly the same for the rectangle as they are for the oval shape. So you already know all of that. Let's look at the oval options. So here's where you can set your start and end angle as well as the inner radius of your shape. So I'm going to pick some random settings. And you'll see that instead of a perfect circle, it creates a sort of a section of a donut or a curved road, or I don't even know how you want to try to explain that shape. Well, it's hard to define your beginning end angle and inner radius if you don't know what it is you're trying to create right away, and it takes some experience to do that successfully. So I'm going to delete this shape. Let's look at the oval primitive, since we know that'll let us adjust our oval options on the fly. So I've reset everything. I'm just going to draw a basic circle. And one quick hotkey you may want to remember, if you hold down Shift, it keeps your circle the same height and width. So it's good for making circles and squares with the oval and rectangle tool. Okay, so here's our oval primitive. You'll notice I have two dots, one on the outside, one on the inside. The inside one does the inner radius. Okay, so I can adjust that. The outside dot lets me control the beginning and end angle of my shape. So if I just want 3/4 of my shape, there I go. If I want to increase it, I can drag or drag this way to decrease. And then I can grab these inner dots to again increase or decrease that inner radius. So this allows me to manipulate my shape even more. Okay, once I've set it the way I want it to look, I can right-click, break apart, and it returns to a basic vector shape. So now I can work with the stroke and the fill and do whatever it is I want to do with this shape. The last tool, which we haven't looked at, is the Polystar tool. And it's actually a really neat tool in that it lets you make polygons and stars. So again, the fill and stroke properties, these are all the same. I'm just going to leave them the same. The options allow you to choose a style, either a polygon or a star, and then how many sides you want and how deep of a star you want, or how high you want the points to be. So let's start with a polygon. We'll stay with the defaults and hit OK. Note we're doing polygon style, so the star point size, it doesn't matter because there's no points to this. It's not a star. So if I click and drag, there's a polygon. I can rotate it, and there we go. So there's a nice pentagon. I can switch the number of sides, so if I do 12, I can have more sides. If I switch the number of sides to 3, which I believe is the lowest you can go, you get a triangle. It's kind of nice. If I switch to star mode, then you get a star with that many points. So we'll say 3 sides just to see what it looks like. So here's a 3-pointed star. It's the Mercedes logo, kind of. I can increase the number of sides. Let's do 8 to have a bigger star. And I can change how deep these points are, or how shallow the points are. So if I switch to star point size, it ranges from 0 to 1. So let's do 0.9. Okay, it's a very shallow star points. If we change it to 0.2, it's going to be very deep star points. Right, and you notice my stroke is so thick it almost covers up all of the fill color. So that's the Poly Star tool. You can make polygons, or you can make stars of various different sides, numbers of sides. So let's look at the last point of this video, and that's drawing object mode. Up till now, let's use an oval. We've been doing just regular primitives. Oops, let's go back to our default settings. There we go. We'll do a nice circle. Right, and I can go in my selection tool, I can select the stroke and the fill independent of one another and work with them. But down here, with my shape tool, I can switch to what's called object drawing mode. And I can create what's called a drawing object. So if I enable that, you notice it's pressed in now. Before it looked like that, it wasn't enabled, so I'll click to enable drawing object mode. And I'll draw the same object. You'll notice it's different in that it has a bounding box around it. So this is a drawing object. If I select this object, I can select stroke and fill. If I select the drawing object, I can't select stroke and fill independently. I can only select the whole drawing object. So you can think of this like a container that holds my vector shape. Both the stroke and fill are inside of this drawing object. Now if I double click this, I can open up that container and look at it. So before we do that, remember this is your location bar. Right now we're just working in scene 1. If I double click this, you notice I'm now inside that drawing object. And you notice this object has been grayed out because it's part of scene 1. So I'm not actively working with it. I can't select it or do anything to it. But this is the vector shape inside of my drawing object. So here I can make some changes. Let's say I just want to move that over, go back to scene 1, and you notice my drawing object has now changed based on the edits I made inside of the drawing object. So you may want to, I'm not saying drawing object mode is better or worse than regular vector mode. I don't use drawing objects very much in my videos just because it's not something I use in my own personal practice. If you like the idea of drawing objects, feel free to use them. If you use drawing objects and you want to break them apart, right-click, break apart, and it becomes just like a regular vector shape and path, or a fill and path to work with. So those are all the object tools, or shape tools I should say, as well as the drawing object mode, which you can enable and disable right there. Hope you learned something. See you in the next video.